He came to fix a flickering light in her quiet house on Juniper Lane. Her hand brushed his, lingering too long, and she whispered, "You're not what I expected." What happened next would haunt him every night. I stepped off the bus at the corner of Vesper Street, the air thick with the scent of wet pavement and the faint tang of diesel from the harbor below. Millhaven, Oregon, was a small town carved into the cliffs where the Pacific Ocean gnawed at the rocks and the wind carried a constant low moan. It was late October, and the town felt like it was bracing for winter, the kind of place where people kept their heads down and their secrets close. I was 22, with a community college degree in electrical engineering that hadn't yet opened any doors, and a backpack slung over one shoulder stuffed with everything I owned: a few shirts, a pair of boots, a laptop that hummed like it was on its last legs. Portland had chewed me up and spit me out, too loud, too fast, too expensive for a guy like me, scraping by on temp jobs and bad coffee. Millhaven was my reset button, a cheap room in a town nobody cared about, a place to figure out what came next. The house was on Juniper Lane, a steep, winding street lined with salt-faded homes and gnarled pines. It was a two-story Victorian, painted a weathered sage green, its porch sagging like it was tired of standing upright. The windows rattled faintly in the evening breeze, and a brass gull knocker gleamed dully on the oak front door. I'd found the listing online, a terse ad from a woman named Eleanor Hadley. Room for rent, $400 month, utilities included, no pets, no smoking, quiet tenant preferred. Her voice on the phone that morning had been crisp, almost formal, like she was reading a grocery list. "Come by at 5, she'd said, and the line went dead before I could ask anything else. Dusk settled over the town, painting the sky a bruised purple as I walked up the gravel path. My boots crunched louder than I liked, and the crash of waves from the cliffs below felt like a pulse under my feet. I knocked on the door, the gull's wings cold under my knuckles, and waited, my breath fogging in the chill. I wondered if I'd made a mistake, if Millhaven was just another dead end. The door swung open, and there she was. Eleanor Hadley stood tall, her dark hair pulled into a loose bun, strands escaping to frame her face. Her eyes caught the fading light, sharp and green like sea glass, and a faint scar curved above her left eyebrow, barely visible but impossible to ignore. She was older than me, late 30s, maybe 40, her face sharp and composed, with a beauty that felt earned, like it had been shaped by years of carrying something heavy. She wore a gray sweater and jeans, simple but deliberate, and her lips pressed into a thin line before softening into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're Simon?" Her voice was low, with a faint rasp that made me think of late nights and quiet confessions. She extended a hand, her grip firm, her skin cool against mine. "Simon Keller," I said, trying to sound steadier than I felt. "Thanks for having me." She nodded, stepping aside to let me in. The foyer smelled of cedar and something floral, maybe lavender, and the air was warm, heavy with the kind of stillness that comes from a house lived in but not crowded. A staircase climbed into shadows on the second floor, and a hallway opened into a living room where a single lamp glowed over a leather couch and a coffee table stacked with books. Novels mostly, their spines creased from use. Everything felt intentional, like she'd placed each item to hold the space together. "The room's upstairs," she said, already moving toward the stairs. Her steps were quiet, purposeful, her shoulders straight but not rigid, like she was used to keeping herself contained. "It's small, but it's clean. You'll have a bathroom, but the kitchen's shared. I don't cook much, so you won't be tripping over me." I followed, my boots loud against the hardwood. The staircase creaked under my weight, and I caught glimpses of framed photos on the walls, black and white shots of the ocean, a lighthouse, a girl with dark hair who looked like she could be Eleanor's sister or daughter. I didn't ask. At the top, she led me to a door at the end of the hall. The room was spare but functional. A single bed with a blue quilt, a desk under a window with a view of the harbor's gray expanse, a dresser with a chipped corner. It was more than I'd had in months, better than the couch I'd crashed on in Portland. "This works," I said, dropping my backpack on the floor. "I'll take it." She raised an eyebrow, her hands clasped in front of her. "You haven't even asked about the deposit." I shrugged, trying to play it off. "Ad said 400. I've got that, plus first month's rent. I'm good for it." Her eyes lingered on me, sharp and searching, like she was trying to decide if I was as steady as I claimed. "All right," she said finally. "Move in when you're ready. I'll have the lease ready tomorrow." We stood there, the silence stretching tight, her fingers brushing the door frame like she needed something to hold on to. I wanted to fill the quiet to ask why she was renting out a room in a house that felt too big for one person, but something in her posture stopped me. "Any rules I should know?" I asked instead. She tilted her head, considering. "Keep it tidy. No music after 10. I like my evenings quiet." "Got it," I said, managing a small smile. She didn't return it, but her eyes softened for a fraction of a second before she turned and headed downstairs, her steps fading into the house's hum. That night, I unpacked what little I had: 3 shirts, a pair of jeans, my laptop, a dog-eared copy of On the Road I'd read twice in high school. The room felt too big for my things, like it was waiting for someone with a real life to fill it. I lay on the bed, the quilt rough under my palms, and listened to the house settle. Creaks from the floorboards, the faint howl of wind outside. I wondered what Eleanor was doing downstairs, if she was reading one of those books or staring out at the harbor, alone in the dark. Morning came with the smell of coffee. I followed it to the kitchen, where Eleanor stood at the counter, her hands wrapped around a mug. She wore a burgundy sweater today, the color warm against her pale skin, but her expression was guarded, like she'd rebuilt her walls overnight. She glanced at me, then nodded toward the coffee pot. "Help yourself," she said. "Mugs are above the sink." "Thanks," I said, grabbing one and pouring. The kitchen was small, bright, with a window overlooking a backyard that sloped toward the cliffs. A potted fern sat on the sill, its leaves curling inward, neglected but still alive. I leaned against the counter, the mug warm in my hands, and stole a glance at her. She was older than me, no question, but there was something about her, maybe the way she held herself, steady but not stiff, that made the years feel less like a wall and more like a bridge. "You settling in?" she asked, her tone neutral, like she was asking about the weather. "Yeah, it's good," I said, "quiet like you said." She nodded, sipping her coffee. "Millhaven's not a party town. You'll adjust." I wanted to ask her more, why she was here, what her life was like before this house, but her posture was a closed book. Instead, I said, "I start at Harper's Electric tomorrow, basic wiring, repairs. If you need anything fixed around here, just say the word." Her lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Good to know. The porch light's been flickering for weeks. Maybe you can take a look." "After work tomorrow," I promised, feeling a small spark of purpose. "No problem." She set her mug down, her fingers lingering on the handle. "You're young for an electrician," she said, not unkindly. "What brought you to Millhaven?" The question caught me off guard, like she'd seen through the cracks in my story. I shrugged, buying time. Needed a change. Portland was too much, too many people, too much noise. I figured a place like this might let me breathe. Her eyes held mine, steady and unyielding, like she was sifting through my words for the truth. "Fair enough," she said after a moment, turning to rinse her mug. "Just don't expect Millhaven to hand you all the answers." The next few days fell into a rhythm. Mornings at Harper's Electric, where I learned the quirks of old coastal wiring under Dale, a foreman with hands like sandpaper and a voice like gravel. Afternoons, I'd walk back to Juniper Lane, sometimes stopping at the Rusty Anchor for a burger and a Coke. Eleanor was often there when I got home, curled up on the couch with a book or typing at a small desk in the living room corner, her fingers quick and precise. We didn't talk much, but there were moments, a nod as I came in, a comment about the fog rolling in, that felt like a conversation, starting, then stopping, before it could grow. One evening, about a week in, I was out on the porch with my toolbox, tackling the flickering light. The bulb was fine. The issue was a loose wire, buried in a tangle of old connections. The air was sharp with salt and cold, my fingers stiff as I worked. Eleanor came out, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her hair catching the last of the daylight. She leaned against the railing, watching me. "Any luck?" she asked, her voice soft but clear over the wind. "Almost," I said, tightening a screw. "Bad wire. Should be good now." I flipped the switch and the light held steady, casting a warm glow over the porch. She made a small sound, almost approval, and crossed her arms. "Not bad, Simon Keller," she said, and there was a warmth in her tone I hadn't heard before, like a door cracking open. I grinned, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Told you I'm good for it." Her eyes crinkled, not quite a smile, and she reached out, brushing a speck of dust from my sleeve. Her fingers lingered, just for a heartbeat, and I felt it. A spark, sharp and sudden, like I'd touched a live wire. She pulled back quickly, her face unreadable, but the air between us had shifted, heavy with something I couldn't name. "Thanks," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, and turned to go inside. At the door she paused, glancing back. "You're not what I expected," she said, and before I could find words, she was gone. I stood there, the cold biting my hands, her words echoing in my head. The light above hummed, steady now, but the night felt unsteady, like the ground had shifted under me. You don't know who'll stand by her side next. This is just the start. Things are about to get heavier. The days in Millhaven folded into each other, each one carrying the weight of the last. 2 weeks into my stay at Eleanor Hadley's house on Juniper Lane, I'd carved out a fragile routine, but it felt like walking on a frozen lake, waiting for the ice to crack. Mornings began with the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen, where Eleanor was always awake before me, her mug steaming on the counter, her presence quiet but undeniable. She'd offer a nod, sometimes a clipped morning, and I'd pour myself a cup, the silence between us thick with things we didn't say. Evenings were different, slower, the kind of quiet that pressed against you, heavy with possibility. I was 22, still figuring out the edges of myself, and she was older, late 30s, maybe 40, her life a closed book I couldn't stop wanting to open. Work at Harper's Electric kept my hands busy and my mind restless. Dale, the foreman, had warmed to me, his gruff instructions giving way to a grudging trust. I spent my days in the damp underbellies of Millhaven's homes, rewiring outlets and untangling decades-old circuits, the salt air eating at everything. The physicality of it grounded me, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the house, to Eleanor's quick glances, the way her fingers curled around her mug, the faint scar above her eyebrow that caught the light when she turned her head. I told myself it was nothing, just a tenant noticing his landlord, but the lie didn't stick. One afternoon I stopped at the market on Bayview Road, a cramped shop with flickering fluorescent lights and shelves stacked with canned goods. I grabbed ground beef, bell peppers, a loaf of sourdough, something to cook to fill the kitchen with a purpose beyond our awkward silences. The cashier, Theo, a wiry guy with an anchor tattoo fading on his forearm, rang me up, his eyes on the darkening sky outside. "Storm's coming," he said, sliding my groceries into a paper bag. "Big one, out of the Pacific." Hope you're not out on those cliffs when it hits. By the time I got back to Juniper Lane, the air was thick with the promise of rain, the sky a heavy gray that pressed down on the town. Eleanor was in the living room, curled on the couch with a book, her legs tucked under her. Her hair was loose today, dark waves spilling over her shoulders, and she wore a navy sweater that made her look softer, less guarded. She glanced up as I set the groceries on the counter, her eyes catching mine for a moment too long before she looked away. "Storm's coming," I said, unpacking the bag. "They're saying it's going to be rough." She closed her book, a worn copy of The Waves, and set it on the coffee table. "I heard power might go out. It's common this time of year." Her voice was steady, but there was a tension in it, like she was bracing for more than just bad weather. "Want me to check anything?" I asked, thinking of the porch light I'd fixed, the old wiring snaking through the house. "Just in case." She considered it, her fingers tracing the edge of the table, a small, unconscious gesture that drew my eye. "There's a generator in the shed out back," she said. "It's been a while since it's been touched. If you're up for it." I nodded, glad for a task to anchor me. "I'll take a look." The shed sat at the edge of the backyard, a weathered shack half swallowed by ferns and brambles. The door groaned as I pushed it open, revealing a clutter of rusted garden tools, a stack of mildewed tarps, and the generator, a squat, dusty thing in the corner. It was an old model, the kind that needed coaxing, but I'd seen worse. I knelt beside it, my toolbox open, checking the fuel line and spark plug as the wind picked up, rattling the shed's tin roof. Rain started to fall, a soft patter that promised to turn brutal. I was testing the pull cord when Eleanor appeared in the doorway, a flashlight in her hand, its beam cutting through the dimness. She'd thrown on a raincoat, the hood framing her face, and her presence made the shed feel smaller, the air tighter. "Any luck?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the growing storm. "It's not dead," I said, wiping sweat from my brow despite the cold. "Need some work, but I'll get it going if we need it." She stepped inside, out of the rain, and the space shrank further. The flashlight cast shadows across her face, highlighting the sharp line of her jaw, the scar that seemed to carry a story she'd never tell. "You don't have to do this, you know," she said, her tone softer now, almost hesitant. "You're a tenant, not my personal repairman." I shrugged, focusing on the generator to keep my hands steady. "I don't mind. Gives me something to do besides sit around." She didn't respond right away, just stood there, the rain drumming louder. Then she said, "You're good at fixing things." "More than just wires." Her words were quiet, but they landed like a spark, sharp and unexpected. I looked up, caught off guard. Her eyes were on me, unguarded for once, and I saw something raw there, something that made my chest tighten. "Thanks," I said, my voice rougher than I meant. I turned back to the generator, my fingers fumbling with the cord, her words echoing in my head. The storm hit that night, a howling beast that shook the house and killed the power just after 7. I was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of chili I'd thrown together, when the lights went out, plunging us into darkness. Eleanor appeared with 2 candles, setting them on the counter, their flames casting a warm, flickering glow. Her face looked softer in the light, but her eyes were sharp, watching me as I stirred the pot. "Generator?" she asked, her voice calm but expectant. "On it," I said, grabbing my jacket. The rain hit me like a wall as I ran to the shed, soaking my clothes in seconds. The generator sputtered to life after a few pulls, and I rigged a cord to the house, keeping the fridge and a couple of lights running. By the time I got back inside, I was drenched, my hair plastered to my forehead, water dripping onto the floor. Eleanor was at the counter, stirring the chili now, her movements slow and deliberate. She glanced at me, then pulled a towel from a drawer and handed it over. "You're gonna freeze," she said, a faint tease in her voice that caught me off guard. I took the towel, drying my face, my eyes never leaving her. "Worth it if the chili's edible," I said, trying to match her tone. She laughed, a low, genuine sound that hit me like a current. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh, and it shifted something in me like a lock turning. "Your recipe," she said, pointing a spoon at me. "If it's bad, I'm blaming you." We sat at the kitchen table, the candles between us, the chili steaming in mismatched bowls. The storm raged outside, but in here it was just us, the flickering light, and a conversation that flowed easier than it ever had. She told me about the time she'd tried to fix a faucet and flooded the bathroom, her hands gesturing as she spoke, her face alive in a way I hadn't seen. I told her about Portland, about my mom's late shifts at the diner, my dad's empty bottles, how I'd always fix things, radios, lamps, my mom's old car, because it was the only way I felt useful. "You're restless," she said at one point, her eyes on her bowl, her voice soft but certain. "You're here, but you're already looking for the next place to go." Her words cut deeper than I expected, like she'd seen the part of me I kept buried. "Maybe," I said, my throat tight, "but I'm here now." She looked at me then, her gaze steady, the candlelight catching the green in her eyes. The air between us felt charged, like the moment before a spark jumps. My hand rested on the table, inches from hers, and I could feel the warmth of her skin without touching it. She reached for her glass, her fingers brushing mine, light but deliberate. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. Her touch lingered, her fingertips grazing my palm, slow and soft, like she was tracing something only she could see. Then she smiled, not the polite smile from that first day, but something raw, unguarded, like she was letting me see a piece of herself she usually kept locked away. "Sorry," she whispered, but she didn't pull away, not right away. Her fingers stayed, and I felt the weight of it, the impossibility of it. She was older, a woman with a life I didn't know, and I was just a kid with a toolbox and nowhere to go. But in that moment, none of it mattered. "I should check the windows," she said suddenly, standing, her chair scraping against the floor. The spell broke, and she moved to the sink, her hands busy with nothing. "Yeah," I said, my voice thick. "Good idea." She left the kitchen, her steps quick, and I sat there, staring at my hand, the ghost of her touch still warm against my skin. The storm roared outside, the candles flickered, and I wondered what I was doing, what we were doing, in this house that felt too small for whatever was growing between us. What she does next, nobody saw coming, but it's going to leave a mark on him forever. The storm clung to Millhaven like a grudge, its winds howling for 2 days straight, turning Juniper Lane into a slick mess of leaves and mud. I spent my days at Harper's Electric, wading through flooded basements and untangling wires in houses that smelled of mildew and salt. My hands were raw, my boots heavy with water, but the work kept me grounded, gave me something to hold on to when my thoughts kept slipping back to Eleanor Hadley and that moment in the kitchen, her fingers on my palm, her smile like a confession. I was 22, still carving out a place in the world, and she was older, maybe 40, her life layered with a past I couldn't touch. The gap between us wasn't just years, it was everything. Her quiet strength, my restless uncertainty, the house that held us both like a held breath. Each evening, I came back to Juniper Lane, the house glowing faintly against the gray dusk. Eleanor was always there, a constant in the storm's chaos, reading in the living room, typing at her desk, or standing at the kitchen window, staring out at the cliffs. Our interactions were small, careful, a nod, a shared pot of coffee, a question about the weather. But they carried a weight I couldn't shake. Her glances lingered longer now, her voice softer when she said my name, and I felt it, that pull, like a current I was too weak to fight. I told myself it was nothing, that she was just being kind, but the memory of her touch burned in me, sharp and undeniable. One evening the storm finally softened to a drizzle, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. I found her in the backyard, standing near the cliff's edge where the grass gave way to jagged rock. The harbor below was a sheet of molten silver, the sky a pale gray that seemed to press down on us. She wore a dark green coat, its hem brushing the ferns, her hair loose and catching the wind like a flag of surrender. She looked like she belonged there, part of the cliffs, the sea, the storm's aftermath, but there was something fragile in her stance, like she might dissolve into the mist if I looked away. I'd come out to check the generator, my toolbox in hand, but seeing her stopped me. "Hey," I said, my voice softer than I meant, afraid to break the moment. "You okay out here?" She turned, slow, like she'd felt me coming. Her eyes met mine, sharp and green, then flicked back to the horizon. "Just needed to breathe," she said, her voice low, carrying a weight I couldn't place. "Storms make me feel caged." I nodded, stepping closer, my boots sinking into the damp grass. "Yeah, I get that. Like the whole town's waiting for something to break." She made a small sound, almost a laugh, and wrapped her arms tighter around herself. "Millhaven's good at waiting, at keeping things buried." Her words hung there, heavy with something unsaid, and I wanted to ask what she meant, but her face was a closed door. I shifted my toolbox to the other hand, the metal cold against my palm. "I was going to check the generator again." "Make sure it's holding up." She glanced at me, her lips curving slightly, not quite a smile. "You're always fixing something, aren't you, Simon?" Her voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, like she was seeing more of me than I wanted to show. "Keeps me out of trouble," I said, trying to keep it light, but my throat felt tight. I took another step, closing the distance between us, the cliffs stretching out below like a warning. She didn't move away, just stood there, her coat brushing the ferns, her eyes on me now. "You're good at it," she said, quieter. "Fixing things, making them work again." The words hit harder than they should have, like she was talking about more than generators or porch lights. I swallowed, my hands restless. "Not everything," I said, my voice rougher than I meant. "Something you just have to let them be." Her eyes softened, and for a moment she looked younger, vulnerable, like the weight she carried had slipped. The drizzle clung to her hair, tiny beads catching the fading light, and I noticed the way her hands trembled slightly, like she was holding herself together by force. She was older than me, her life marked by things I couldn't guess, but right then she felt closer, like we were both standing on the same unsteady ground. "I should go in," she said, but her feet didn't move. Her eyes held mine, and the air between us thickened, charged with something I couldn't name. I stepped closer, not thinking, just feeling the pull, and she didn't back away. The wind whipped around us, cold and sharp, but it was nothing compared to the heat of her gaze. "Eleanor," I said, my voice low. "Raw? What are we doing?" She froze, her breath catching, her eyes wide and unguarded. For a second I thought she'd turn and walk away, leave me standing there with the rain and my own stupidity. But she didn't. "I don't know," she whispered, and it was the rawest thing I'd ever heard, like she'd torn open a piece of herself and let me see. My hand moved before I could stop it, brushing hers, my fingers finding her palm. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand, her fingertips tracing the lines of mine, slow and deliberate, like she was searching for something. Her touch was light, but it burned, a quiet fire that spread through me. She looked up, her smile small, fragile, like it might break if I breathed too hard. "Simon," she said, her voice barely above the wind, "this can't happen." I nodded because I knew she was right. She was older, her life a tangle of things I couldn't touch. Maybe a husband, a family, a past that weighed her down. I was just a kid, passing through, my life barely started. But my hand stayed in hers, and hers in mine, and the space between us felt like it was collapsing, like the cliffs were crumbling into the sea. "Why not?" I asked, the words slipping out, reckless and desperate. She laughed, a sharp broken sound, and shook her head. "Because it's not that simple. You're young, Simon. You've got everything ahead of you. I'm—" She stopped, her eyes dropping to our hands, her fingers still tracing mine. "I'm not someone you should want." "I don't care," I said, and it was the truth, raw and unfiltered. "I don't know who you are, Eleanor, but I want to. I can't stop wanting to." Her breath hitched, and for a moment I thought she might break, her eyes glistening in the dim light. But she didn't. She squeezed my hand, her grip tight, then let go, the absence of her touch like a physical ache. "Come inside," she said, her voice steady now, like she was pulling herself back from the edge. "You're soaked." I followed her back to the house, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The kitchen was warm, the candles still burning from the night before, their light flickering across the walls. She handed me a towel, her movements quick, almost mechanical, like she was trying to outrun whatever had happened outside. I dried my hands, my eyes on her, watching the way her shoulders tensed, the way her fingers gripped the counter. "Eleanor," I said softer now, stepping closer. She didn't turn, but I saw her pause, her hands still on the counter, her knuckles white. "I'm not trying to push you, I feel something, and I know you do too." She turned then, her eyes bright with something I couldn't read. Pain, fear, maybe something deeper. "You're 22, she said, her voice low but firm. "You have your whole life ahead of you. I've got a daughter, Simon, she's almost your age. I've got a life that doesn't have room for this." The mention of a daughter hit me like a wave, cold and heavy. I hadn't known, hadn't even thought to ask. It made her feel further away, like a door slamming shut. But I couldn't stop. "Doesn't have room or you won't let it," I asked, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. Her lips parted, but no words came. The kitchen was silent except for the faint drip of the faucet, the distant howl of the wind. She stepped closer, so close I could smell the rain on her coat, the lavender in her hair. Her hand hovered near my face, trembling like she wanted to touch me but couldn't. "You don't know what you're asking," she said, her voice breaking, raw and open. "Then tell me," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Tell me why we're here, like this." She closed her eyes, and when she opened them, they were wet, though no tears fell. "Because I'm lonely," she said, the words a wound laid bare. "Because I've been alone for so long, I forgot what it feels like to want someone, and you make me remember." The air left my lungs, her confession hanging between us like a fragile thread. I saw her then, not just the woman who rented me a room, but the person beneath, someone who'd carried loss, who'd built walls to keep it at bay. I wanted to reach for her, to pull her close, but I didn't. I just stood there, letting her words settle, heavy and true. She stepped back, her hand dropping, her face closing off again. "This can't happen," she said, softer now, like she was pleading with herself as much as me. "Not because I don't want it, because I do." I nodded, my throat tight. "Okay," I said, because what else was there? She was right, and I knew it, but it didn't dull the ache, didn't stop the pull I felt toward her. "Okay." She turned to the candles, blowing one out with a quick breath, the room dimming. "I'm going to bed," she said, not looking at me. "Good night, Simon." "Good night," I said, my voice hollow. Her footsteps faded up the stairs, and I stood there, staring at the remaining candle, its flame flickering like it was fighting to stay alive. I thought about her hand in mine, her smile, the way she'd said my name. I thought about her daughter, her loneliness, the life she'd lived before I ever knocked on her door. And I thought about myself, 22 and lost, wanting something I couldn't have, something that felt too big for this small, storm-battered town. The next morning, I packed a bag, just enough for a few days. I left a note on the counter saying I'd be back to settle the rent. I didn't say where I was going because I didn't know. I walked down Juniper Lane, the harbor glinting in the distance, and I didn't look back. But at the corner of Vesper Street, I stopped, my hand tight on my backpack strap, her smile burning in my mind, fragile and fleeting. I wondered if I'd ever feel that again, that impossible thing that had changed me without ever taking root. Nobody expected what happened next, but it's the kind of moment that stays with you forever,